Hi, Bill DeSimone. I developed the moment arm exercise approach to weight training, which you might have seen in a manual or at a conference or now on video. This approach came about less because I was trying to become the next fitness guru and more as a response to my own injuries. A little over 10 years ago, I ruptured my own biceps and triceps, which, shall we say, got my attention. I'd been training with weights for about 25 years at the time. I had been certified as a trainer. I'd been working as a trainer. I had competed, or at least participated, in bodybuilding and other competitions. I had memorized and studied years of muscle magazines and mainstream exercise books, so I thought I knew what I was doing. Once the injuries healed and I got back to the gym, I noticed that some exercises were completely unaffected, and yet others I could barely get into position to do the exercise. So I put aside all the exercise books and I went to physiology, biomechanics, mechanics, kinesiology texts, and I was trying to figure out what was happening. Much to my surprise, a lot of what I'd been doing in the name of exercise, whether it was barbells, dumbbells, or machines, contradicted proper muscle and joint function, and my thought was that the unnecessary wear and tear over the years had probably set me up for both injuries. And since I couldn't find another hobby because, I got to work out, I redesigned how I was personally doing the exercises. So I started with the instruction I knew, and then I would filter it through the biomechanics. That redesign eventually became the Moment Arm Exercise Manual. Now, if you're not familiar with the manual, behind me are some pages from it. In it, I identify disconnects between big E exercise and biomechanics, and then I redesign exercises to be more congruent. Not to mention, I provide a quick summary of relevant, if simplified, mechanics and a full bibliography and references. First, let me describe the disconnect, and then what I mean by congruent. There are a number of conventional free weight exercises, as well as modern machine exercises, that load the joints in vulnerable positions, such as here in a dumbbell pullover, and here in a deadlift, here in a squat, and in the fully stretched out position of a pull down. By vulnerable, I mean that the joints either shouldn't move into these positions because of a bony or a soft tissue obstruction, or they shouldn't be loaded in these positions because the prime mover may not be able to exert enough force, and so the smaller, deeper muscles may strain. Even though we call it exercise, we can still put the shoulders in impingement, we can still bend knees and elbows the wrong way, we can still flatten the curves in the spine, we can still strain the rotator cuff, even with good intentions. There are also exercises, not necessarily the same ones, that load the muscles in a pattern that the prime mover can't accommodate. And by that I mean the exercise is mechanically hardest where the target muscle is biomechanically weakest. For instance, with a dumbbell pullover, the beginning stretch position, where the lats are weakest with your arms overhead, but that's mechanically the hardest part of the exercise. Or the vice versa, the opposites can happen, such as in a side raise. The exercise is mechanically easiest when your arms are hanging straight down at the bottom. Your target muscle is relatively strong biomechanically. These parts, the joint postures and motions, and the mismatched load, are part of the disconnect. The first part of the redesign was to use biomechanically safe joint postures. The second part was to use what I called congruent exercise. In mathematics, curves are called congruent when they coincide exactly when superimposed. The curves we're concerned with are the muscle torque curve and the resistance torque curve. The muscle torque curve represents the biomechanic strength as the joint moves. It's a function of your muscle force and the internal lever, or moment arm, that it acts through. It's variable depending on the joint angle. It's predictable, not malleable, regardless of what the magazines imply, and it's documented in textbooks. The resistance torque curve is a product of the actual weight and the external lever, also a moment arm, created as the weight moves around your body, at least for free weights and simple machines. It represents the mechanical difficulty through the range of motion for that particular exercise. Ideally, the mechanical difficulty matches the biomechanic strength through the whole motion of the exercise. Your effort then becomes more efficient. It goes towards working your muscles as opposed to fighting a mechanical sticking point. So now we combine the efficiency of congruent exercise with biomechanically safe joint postures and motions, and we can get to the benefits of weight training quicker and with fewer complaints. Now, you don't have to memorize muscle torque curves and joint positions and diagram out moment arms and try to coordinate it all, because that's what I've done in the manual. And as it happens, if an exercise just feels hard, if there's no sticking point, no rest point, and no joint pain, that's a good hint that it's congruent. Here are some diagrams from the manual showing congruent exercises. We have a straight arm pull down, a reverse grip bench press for the delts, and the pull up. And the manual goes into detail for most of the other major muscle groups. The chin-up is a classic upper body exercise that with a few tweaks can load the muscles very efficiently and work within safe motions for your joints. Unfortunately, in practice, between sloppy performance and some curious joint positions in the name of variety, a bad chin-up can really wear on your shoulder. First, we'll look at how to do a chin-up congruent with proper muscle and joint function, and then we'll explain some of the biomechanics behind each step. Okay, step one, about a shoulder width grip with either a parallel or partially supinated hand grips. 2, pull your shoulders away from your ears. Third, lean or arch back. Now you're ready to start. 4, as you pull, allow a slight crunch at the top. Stop when your chin passes your fists. And as you lower, don't bounce out of the bottom. The first step, the shoulder width grip. The issue isn't with the hands, it's with the path of the upper arm. So try this. Turn your palms up and hold your elbows in tight and start to raise your arms overhead. You're okay up to about 90 degrees, and then it gets tight in the shoulder. In order to go higher, you have to internally rotate, and then it releases. What happens is, up to about at 90 degrees, the ligaments bind. So if the weight or your body weight pulls your arms overhead, you're stretching ligaments, not muscle. This isn't good because shoulder laxity gets fixed by surgery. Now, if you go behind the neck, or with an especially wide grip, your arm has to move into external rotation. The lats connect your pelvis to the front of your upper arm. So in addition to doing shoulder extension, it also does internal rotation along with the pecs and that part of the rotator cuff. Now there's no big back muscle to help with external rotation. So that part of the rotator cuff strains against the bigger lats and pecs as well as the other part of the rotator cuff. Now if you split the difference, if instead of being fully abducted, externally rotated, or in full flexion, if you split the difference in the 3/4 plane, you have no big ligament binding and no conflicting muscle action. That should determine your grip width, literally the path of least resistance, so that you can concentrate on the muscle work and not on fighting your own joints. Here's another aspect of the shoulder width grip. Now this is based on an overhead x-ray of the right shoulder. And what it shows is, with the arm in neutral, the socket of the ball and socket opens up not straight ahead or to the side, but in this three-quarter plane. This is part of the reason why going overhead is cleanest here. If you go to either extreme, very behind the neck or very close grip, you create an impingement here or here, not an acute injury, but over time it is putting extra stress in the shoulder area. Now some people can get away with a wider range because the depth of the socket is very individual, from a very deep socket to a very shallow one. So it's difficult to specify the exact one correct arm path. But if you're training with an eye towards the future, the two extremes, behind the neck or a super close grip, would be the ones to avoid. Okay, the third step is to lean or arch back. So, peak torque for a shoulder extension, come on down, let me have this, is at 90 degrees, so which means you're less strong as you move further away from 90 degrees of flexion. If you're just hanging, your lats are in a weak position, your biceps and triceps are in a weak position, your deltoids are in active insufficiency, your traps are stretched out. The only thing holding your arm into your upper body is your rotator cuff, which is also in a weak position, but is trying to hold on involuntarily. By depressing your scapula and leaning back, the lats and traps are closer to their peak torque, so they can take the load off the rotator cuff. You want to keep your shoulders down and back during the pull, so your lats have a stable platform to pull on your upper arm. Now at the top, stop at about where your chin clears your grip. If you try to touch your chest to the bar, it's more squeezing your shoulder blades than shoulder extension, so it shifts the load from the lats to the traps, which are in active insufficiency. The most vulnerable part of the rep is your arms overhead, especially at the end of the set when the bigger muscles are fatigued, so make a point of not bouncing in and out of the bottom. Save your rotator cuffs, live to train another day. If you're not ready for bodyweight chins, pull downs, machine assists, or negative chins, mimicking the same postures and movements, do the same thing. Whatever overhead pull you do, the lats are the biggest in the chain, so the body recruits them to bear most of the load. The issue is how much strain you want to add to your shoulder. Don't confuse touching your chest to the bar or an awkward grip with better muscle loading. And certainly don't confuse bouncing your body weight out of the bottom with toughening your rotator cuff. You're not getting used to it, you're getting away with it until you're about my age. So it's your choice, but to sum up the most joint-friendly chin-up, shoulder width grip, shoulders down and back, and then pull your elbows from your eyes to your sides. Yes, yes, you're muscular. got blisters on my fingers. Remember the old riddle, what's heavier, 10 pounds of feathers or 10 pounds of lead? Here's the gym version. Where are these dumbbells heaviest? Are they heaviest here? Heaviest here? Or heaviest here? And the answer is nowhere. They're the same dumbbells. But something changed position to position to make them feel heavier, and that something was the moment arm. Now the moment arm technically is the perpendicular distance between the line of force and the line of the axis. What does that mean? We're going to use a seesaw to demonstrate. Here's the axis. Here are the people. Let's call one Lou, one Arnold, representing the weights. And here are the moment arms. So here's the line of the axis. Here's the line of force. Here's another line of force. And here is one moment arm, the perpendicular distance between the two, and here's the other moment arm. Now, assuming they weigh the same, if they're the same distance from the axis, they balance, because the weight times the same moment arm creates an equal torque. But let's say now that Arnold moves further away from the axis. It tips, even though he still weighs the same, because now his weight acts through a bigger moment arm. Now, let's say Arnold's by himself on the seesaw, standing right over the axis, and Lou is just trying to hold down the other end with his hands. When Arnold stands over the axis, it's easy. The line of the axis and the line of his force coincide, so there's no moment arm created. But as Arnold moves progressively away from the axis, it gets harder because he's creating a greater moment arm. In the dumbbell fly, the person walking away from you on the seesaw is the dumbbell. So it's the change in the moment arm, and in turn the change in resistance torque, that makes one position feel heavier than the other. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you do have to manage it. Ideally, by matching that maximum moment arm with the joint angle for peak muscle torque. The dumbbell fly would seem to be an ideal choice to work the pectorals. Pectorals are the prime mover for horizontal adduction, which the fly clearly is, and the hardest mechanical part of the fly comes pretty close to matching the joint angle for peak muscle torque, which is reported at minus 30 degrees of adduction. So your upper arms are slightly behind the plane of your shoulders. But there are some issues. Okay, first, you generally start the fly at the top with the weights directly over your shoulders where there's a zero moment arm. And even though you move towards peak muscle torque, the change from zero moment arm to maximum moment arm is too drastic. And you get the timber effect, especially if it gets too heavy with the weights. What you do intuitively is you break at the elbow at the bottom, so that the maximum moment arm is slightly reduced, and what you should do voluntarily is not lock out. So you're going to keep the dumbbells away from that directly over the shoulder position, away from zero moment arm. Instead of having a sticking point and then a rest point, you're just going to feel effort. So slightly short of maximum moment arm to slightly short of zero moment arm. Now a third concern with the dumbbell fly, very important from a safety standpoint, is to not let the weight stretch you into the overhand position. Avoid loading horizontal abduction with external rotation. The pectorals attach to the outside of the upper arm. So when you're here, you're beginning to stretch, but when you add external rotation, the pectorals are taut and can't help protect your shoulder. In jiu-jitsu, this is a classic submission no matter how strong your opponent's pectorals are. Here's an alternate version of the fly that addresses all these issues. First, it starts at a maximum moment arm, so if your weight is too heavy, you know right away. Plus, if you lose it, just stand up. So, bend at the hips to engage the weight stack, and then you contract, but you never reach a zero moment arm. The line of force represented by the cable never actually gets over the axis at the shoulder. So the effort feels even throughout the rep. Man cleavage. So the ideal pectoral exercise would avoid zero moment arm. It would reduce the maximum moment arm by lowering to a bent elbow, and it would discourage you from externally rotating at the stretch. I've been developing a device to do just that. What? Somebody else thought of it? All right, the range of motion is deliberate. At the top, you want to not lock out your elbows, but you also don't want to hunch forward. Okay? That movement is scapular protraction. The pecs would be holding statically while the psoas would be moving the scapula. Not necessarily a bad idea, but not with a load that challenges the much bigger pectorals. At the bottom, you don't want to go too deep, say, to here, because there's no kneecap at the shoulder. The purpose of the kneecap is to keep the line of force of the quads away from the center axis of your knee, to create an internal moment arm. That doesn't exist in the shoulder, so the deeper you go, the closer the line of force from the pectorals goes to the axis. Less leverage for the pectorals, so the load that was supported by the pectorals, the deltoids, the triceps, your arm bones, is now straining the shoulder. A perfectly valid substitute would be a chest press machine using the same range of motion. Not locking out, and then just breaking the plane of your shoulders. Which leads us to some muscle myths about pectoral training. You change the shape of your pectorals by changing exercises. Now, look back at any bodybuilder from the 70s and look at that guy's muscle shape over the years. It doesn't change. Maybe he gets overall bigger or smaller, but the shape doesn't change in spite of the fact that over a lifetime of training, he or she probably did a variety of exercises. Then look at that bodybuilder surrounded by his contemporaries. They all have different shape, even though they've all done the same exercises. Once you're training, your muscle shape is your muscle shape, and any change in appearance depends on how much fat you're carrying, and for us older guys, how tight your skin is. You work your inner, middle, outer pec, or your upper, middle, lower pec by changing angles, exercises, whatever. Doesn't matter. Because A, you're not going to change your shape, but B, that paradigm of isolating out parts of the pectoral is not entirely supported by the biomechanics. First, fiber recruitment is based on load, speed, and probably effort, not joint angle or feel or visual protrusion. Second, at great loads or efforts, there is a successive recruitment of muscle groups, starting with the closest and working its way out. So even if you could isolate the sternal portion of the pectoral, the most proximal muscle groups are the clavicular and abdominal attachments, so they would unavoidably get involved. More specific to the pectoral. More specific myth to the pectorals is the inner, middle, and outer idea. Pectorals attach across the clavicle, across the sternum, and then across the ribs. And all these fibers attached in those different spots merge into a single tendon crossing in front of the upper arm and attaching on the outside of the shoulder. They don't attach from the sternum to here, then from the middle to here, and then from here to the end, sort of in vertical stripes. If you do an exercise that you feel in these vertical segments, that just means the sticking point is hitting at that point in the muscle torque curve, not that you're isolating a vertical strip of fibers. The fibers that work from here to here are the same fibers that work from here to here, are the same fibers that work from here to here, just at different points on their muscle torque curve. Now the upper, middle, lower idea has slightly more substance. The clavicular pec works separate from the sternal and the abdominal attachments in shoulder flexion with the front deltoid. The sternal and the abdominal attachments work separate from the clavicular for a lower adduction. So conceivably, you could try to work each section separately, but would that change the shape of your pectoral? Or does it just reduce the weight in your hand because less muscle is working at an awkward angle? One thing that is certain is if your arm path splits the difference between pure flexion and pure adduction, if your arm path is here, you engage all three areas of the pectoral in one movement. It's probably the safest path for your shoulder joint, and it will allow you to work with heavier weight compared to other shoulder positions. So whatever shape you're going to get more efficiently. So to summarize congruent exercise for the pectorals, position your upper arm between flexion and adduction. There's no knee cap at the shoulder, so don't overstretch with the weight. And maintain your effort throughout the rep by not locking out, avoiding zero moment arm.
Who is this Bill Simone character and what does he know? His whole personal training studio could fit in my right biceps. I won the Mr. Olympia 8 times. I'm the governor of California. I make movies.
Okay, Bob, you're up. Biceps, 2 heads, 2 questions. Do you have to curl? And does the type of curl make a difference? The short answer is maybe not, and it does make a difference, but not what you might expect. The long answer starts with the anatomy. 2 attachments on the scapula, merging into one on the inside of the radius. That means it crosses 3 joints: shoulder, elbow, and radioulnar. Fully contracted position, supinated, bent elbow, shoulder flexion. Fully stretched position, pronated, straight elbow, shoulder extension. The biomechanics texts are very clear that these are very weak positions, the insufficiencies, that your body generally avoids in daily life. Let me interrupt myself to address the extremes of muscle length. The fully stretched or passive insufficient, or the fully contracted or active insufficient positions. It's not only those positions that interfere with muscle function. So it's not as if you have a flat level of muscle force and then you hit those positions and it falls off the table down to 0. For starters, it never goes to 0 because you can always hold statically. But in between these 2 positions, you do have a peak of force. Now, while the peak is the strongest, there is a range of lengths around the peak where your muscle strength or function is relatively unaffected, at least compared to near the extremes. Now, outside of this range, there is a crossover point where you're getting closer to the extreme positions and your function and muscle strength will be affected. It's a slope, not a cliff. Now, the body normally avoids these extreme positions in daily life, but if you do some kind of concentration curl or some kind of extreme stretch position curl, you do run into these positions. Now if you load these areas, near fully contracted and near fully stretched, all you do is reduce the weight in your hand. Okay? You never flatten the curve out by developing more strength at the extremes, and you never invert the curve where you're stronger at the extremes compared to in the middle. In practice, when you do load these extremes, such as with a concentration curl or some extreme stretch position curl, you have to notice a difference in weight. Nobody concentration curls, for instance, more than a good standing curl. Now, while these curves are true, they are academic, literally. What we really need to know is what are the joint angles and limb positions that are around the peak torque, and then in turn, what exercises load those positions. We're not concerned with loading here or here, but there are two strong biomechanic positions for the biceps. Now remember, the biceps doesn't attach to the upper arm. So if the shoulder moves, it changes the length of the biceps. One strong position is stretched over one joint, shortened over the other. Stretched over one joint, shortened over the other. The so-called sawing action. So the answer to the question, do you have to curl, is maybe not. If you're happy with the size of your upper arms, if you row, chin, pull down, or even deadlift heavy enough, you can omit curls and lose nothing functionally, since all those movements load the sawing action. Functionally, the biceps aren't that important. Other muscles supinate, other muscles flex the elbow, other muscles flex the shoulder. If you avulse or rupture the biceps, you may lose some shoulder stability. Now, as far that strategy may not work for your upper arms, because the texts say that the biggest muscle in a chain will bear the load as a way of the body saving energy. And since the lats and traps are the biggest in those chains, if you don't go heavy enough, there'll be no reason for your body to use the biceps. But that's biomechanics. For the beach. Okay, so if the pull heavy strategy doesn't work for you, the other biomechanically strong position for the biceps with the shoulder fixed is reported at about 70 to 90 degrees of elbow flexion, right about there. Well, where's the sticking point in a barbell curl? Also at 90 degrees of flexion. So if you do a curl without a lockout, like so, it actually does a pretty good job of matching resistance torque to muscular torque. As opposed to this, which would be with a lockout. Straight elbows, lifting up, and then resting at the top. Okay? So, lockout, no resistance, no moment arm. Difficult, no moment arm again. And then with no lockout. Okay, some moment arm at the bottom. The effort and the resistance are more evenly matched. Now what happens when you go too heavy or you get too fatigued? Okay? Invariably, you get some lean. Now some would call that cheating. No, this is cheating. Okay, that's a cheat. This is something else. Now, ordinarily, when your center of gravity goes outside of your base of support, like so, you should lose your balance. But you never see people curling, falling on their face. And when the barbell moves forward, it's the same effect as your center of gravity moving outside of your base of support. What happens is, as the center of gravity moves forward, the muscles around your spine pull your head and shoulders backwards to maintain balance. It's not the same as a heave or a cheat, it's involuntary. Okay, one fix is to use a split stance to give yourself a broader base front to back. Okay? So now, when the barbell shifts forward, your center of gravity stays within your base of support. And you don't lean. Now that's a low-tech fix. Let's take a look at a couple of higher-tech fixes. Another way to address the shift in center of gravity is with a so-called cantilever design. A cantilever is a structural member, such as a beam, that projects beyond a fulcrum and is supported by a downward force beyond the fulcrum. So in the Scott bench curl, right here, your arms would be the beam, extending this way. The bench pad is the fulcrum, and your body weight would be the downward force on one side of the fulcrum. Since the weight in your hand is less than your body weight, it no longer disrupts your balance. Now, next to that is a Nautilus version, but the cantilever concept, or the Scott bench concept, has been used for just about every curl machine. But early versions of both the Scott bench curl and the machine curls had a flaw unrelated to the center of gravity issue. Since the barbell is such a common tool, we're tempted to use it on the Scott bench, and early machines mimic that same hand position of full supination. The problem with full supination is that the elbow doesn't bend at a right angle. The radius comes up higher on the upper arm than the ulna, so your hand moves towards the center in elbow flexion. This is called, what the texts call, the carrying angle. So now if your arms are over a fulcrum in full supination, the carrying angle wants to direct your hands towards your face. But if you're holding a straight bar or machine handles, your hands are fixed. The distance between your hands are fixed. They can't move towards your face. And since your elbows are now pushing down into the pad, you get about halfway up and then you stall. Because while the elbow and hands want to move this way, the machine won't let you. You end up working against your own joints. Now, intuitively, bodybuilders realized this wasn't working, so they switched to dumbbells or an easy curl bar, and the equipment designs went the same way. The reason this works is that the carrying angle disappears outside of full supination. Now, I'm fully aware that Nautilus lore dictates full supination to work the biceps, but that's not entirely the case. Remember that the biceps attaches on the inside of the radius. So if your hand is pronated or neutral, the force from the biceps is wrapped under the radius and has to unwrap it before it can pull straight up. As long as your hand is slightly more supinated than neutral, but short of full supination, the biceps will be the prime mover and you won't run into the carrying angle issue. Here's a recent design by Nautilus, and Hammer did something similar that addressed the center of gravity and the carrying angle issues. Okay, here is the fulcrum for the cantilever. So your upper arm rests on here. Your heavier body weight sits, and here's the handles that you pull. And these axes for the movement arms aren't in line, and they're angled to accommodate the carrying angle. Here are the most recent designs I've seen that address these issues. You've got independent axes to address the carrying angle. You've got a small cantilever effect. You have a pad here for your upper arm to rest against. And you've got a much broader base, so you have a more stable center of gravity, which of course now brings these curl machines up to the level of sophistication of this dusty exercise. The classic incline curl. You have a broad base, so the weights don't affect your center of gravity. You're already leaning back, so the muscles around your spine aren't involved. You can supinate more than neutral, but avoid the carrying angle. And the sticking point matches the joint angle for peak muscle torque, especially if you don't lock out. One more thing, the head position Neck flexion triggers the tonic neck reflex, which according to the text facilitates pulling contractions. Which curl you do primarily depends on which joints you need to protect. Or you can protect all your joints and do an incline curl or the machine version. In spite of the fitness cliches, your choice of curl will have no effect on selectively shaping your biceps nor strengthening one joint angle over another. Muscle torque exists in a predictable, documented pattern, which explains why your same biceps has to use different weights for different curls. You're simply loading a different point on the muscle torque curve. And if you look at biceps from the Arnold era, where each of the top guys had a different shaped biceps, Arnold versus Franco versus Bill Grant versus Frank Zane versus Boyer Coe, and so on, they all did the same exercises. So if shape was malleable, they should have ended up with the same looking biceps, and they obviously didn't. The one thing that will affect the shape of your biceps is to rupture one head off the scapula and not repair it. The biceps will then shrink down, reattach randomly, and just sit somewhere in your upper arm. Here's a look at my own biceps from 1996, 2 years before I ruptured it. And here it is now, about 11 years after rupturing it and not repairing it. And you can see a divot. Not a recommended strategy. Stick with the incline curls. Conventional instruction for the forearms focuses on wrist curls and reverse wrist curls, with maybe some grip work thrown in as an afterthought. This implies that the flexors and extenders of the wrist make up the bulk of the forearm, and that the finger flexors are relatively minor muscles. Actually, not only is the opposite true, but that approach omits a potentially large part of the forearm, the brachioradialis. Now, the biomechanics below the elbow are complex compared to, say, the quad. Quad has a lot of meat, few attachments, and one or two functions. The forearm has a relatively smaller area, many attachments, many functions. Elbow flexion, wrist extension, pronation, supination, deviation, power grip, precision grip, plus what all the fingers do. Fortunately, these movements are created by different combinations of muscles, not separate muscles, so you don't have to do a separate exercise for each movement. A lot of the texts break the forearm muscles up into three groups: radial, volar ulnar, and dorso-ulnar, or in gym terms, reverse curl, reverse wrist curl. Unfortunately, those happen to be three badly designed exercises. Reverse curls first. First, the good. The reverse curl does target the brachioradialis. The radius is crossed over, so the bicep can't pull as efficiently. So the biggest, most superficial elbow flexor is the brachioradialis. There are two problems, though. First is the pronator teres. In order to grab the bar, you have to pronate, turn your palm down, and you can feel the pronator teres contracting with your thumb right here. Since the pronator teres is also an elbow flexor, that means it partially contracts to get the bar, and then it pulls into active insufficiency when you flex the elbow. So fatigue in the smaller pronator is going to interfere with your work for the larger brachioradialis. The second problem with the reverse curl is the thumb. Obviously, to get into position, your thumb goes under the bar and bears some of the load. This posture with the thumb opposite the fingers is called precision grip, used for accuracy and refinement of touch, such as threading a needle. This is the real significance of the opposable thumb, the capacity for precision work. The thumb adductor doesn't have the capacity for hypertrophy because it would interfere with the rest of the hand. When you look at a chart of the hand and forearm anatomy, you see how small the thumb adductor is versus the much larger finger flexors. The other major grip is called the power grip. Instead of the thumb being opposite the fingers, The thumb works to the side, maneuvers the object into the palm so that the larger finger flexors can exert the force. Now, dumbbell hammer curls solve both problems. You're using a power grip, so your thumb isn't a factor. You're only partially pronated, so the pronated teres pulling into active insufficiency isn't a factor. So it works to brachioradialis without a lot of extra noise. There are other aspects of the forearm, though, to look at. Here's why wrist curls and reverse wrist curls aren't the best way to train your forearms. Make a fist, and then bend it. If you're being honest, you can't maintain as tight a fist in flexion as you can in neutral. Think of a disarm in martial arts. You always force the wrist into flexion to open the grip, and then you remove the weapon. The answer is in the anatomy. There are deep wrist flexors that connect the forearm to the hand and cross the wrist. But the largest, most superficial muscle on this side, the flexor digitorum superficialis, the finger flexors, cross the wrist and the finger joints. So when you grip, it partially contracts, but then when you also bend the wrist, it pulls into active insufficiency. The old wrist curl instruction to squeeze the bar as tight as you can and then bend your wrists can't be done. You can either squeeze the bar as tight as you can, or you can bend the wrists, but not both. Let's look at the other side, wrist extension. If you've ever done these exercises, you know you have to use a significantly lighter weight to reverse wrist curl than to wrist curl. And again, with the martial arts, you know you can't wrist extension your way out of a joint lock. Again, in the anatomy, the finger extenders and wrist extenders are much smaller than the finger flexors and the wrist flexors. This wouldn't make sense to have much larger muscles on one side of the wrist than the other if the function of these muscles was to move the hands with force, but it's not. The role of the wrist extenders is to position the hand for a stronger grip by keeping the larger finger flexors away from active insufficiency. So if you want to work the larger finger flexor muscles and the deep wrist flexors and the smaller wrist extenders in one movement, it would be a gripping movement pulling into extension. All right, this is an unconventional gripping exercise using a freedom trainer. You could also use regular dumbbells. I prefer this to the old-fashioned hand grip exercise because with the hand grip exercise, while it does work the finger flexors, the other end of the hand grip cuts into your hand right where the finger tendons are trying to work. So what you're going to do, hold on to the handles of the dumbbells with the last joint of your hand, of the fingers, with your wrists bent into flexion. As you grip, as you make a fist, you're going to pull into wrist extension. Okay, so here's a little bit of a close-up of the action. Wrist flexion, hook grip, tighten the grip, and move into extension. Now I wouldn't twist as part of the exercise, but just for demonstration purposes. You're in flexion with the hook grip, and now you close it up into extension. If you notice, you're not beating up on your thumb or the heel of your hand like you have to do with conventional hand grips. These two exercises, hammer curls and gripping into extension, should be enough for generally bigger forearms and a better grip with a lot less strain on your hands and fingers. Probably not enough for grip strength specialists. Things like pinch gripping and tearing a deck of cards in half, these things are impressive enough at face value, but when you study the biomechanics, they're even more impressive. If you're already doing those things, what are you watching me for? Besides, plenty of guys develop pretty good forearms without doing any of what I said. I was originally going to start this discussion on calf training with pointing out some of the myths from the old muscle magazines. Then it occurred to me that maybe my information was a bit outdated. Maybe I should check the internet and some more recent books to see what they're saying now. Well, the same bad information from 35 years or so ago is still out there. Let's put some of those things down now, shall we? First myth. change the foot angle to work the inner, middle, or outer portion of the calf. Now, a quick look at any anatomy book, and I happen to like the Concise Book of Muscles by Chris Jarmy, but anyone will do, shows that both heads of the gastroc and the wide attachment of the soleus come together into one tendon. Now maybe if there was a separate tendon for each head of the gastroc, you could angle it to emphasize one head working over the other, but all that muscle pulls on one tendon, so the idea that you can selectively work and develop one head over the other is speculative at best. Now, the act of turning the foot in or out does work muscles in the lower leg other than the gastroc and soleus. So supination and inversion, or pronation and eversion, is done by different combinations of deeper muscles, but there are safer ways of training those muscles. Manual resistance, tubing, or balancing on one leg. If you've ever twisted an ankle, okay, you know what happens when you load a significant weight vertically through the foot and then try to turn the foot. The deeper muscles are meant to stabilize the foot and ankle, not support a load. One common point that comes through all the biomechanics texts is that the bigger, more superficial muscles with few attachments, like the gastroc, are responsible for moving limbs and exerting force. And the deeper muscle groups, smaller, closer to the joint, many attachments, are responsible for maintaining a posture over time. One set is for movement and force, one is for stabilization and needs endurance. Here's a second myth. The calves are a dense, tough, stubborn muscle group and require more frequent, more volume, more intense training. This is such a complete misread of what's happening, it's actually quite impressive. The reason you can handle more weight and more volume for the calves isn't because you walk and climb steps and ride bikes every day and so it makes the calves resistant to exercise. It's because you have a wheelbarrow at the ankle, and that allows you to walk and climb steps and do lots of sets and reps and lots of weight on calf exercise. Most muscles and joints are third-class levers. They have an axis, they have an effort, they have resistance. They leverage distance. A little bit of motion at the elbow creates a lot of motion at the hand. Now here's what I mean by wheelbarrow at the ankle. Okay, here's the axis of a wheelbarrow, which corresponds to the axis at the metatarsal break. Here's where the effort's applied. The effort's applied at the handles of a wheelbarrow. The effort's applied at the end of your heel. Here's the resistance for a wheelbarrow. And if you do your calf raises, your heel raises imprecisely, the resistance falls between the axis and the effort. So just like in a wheelbarrow, where a little bit of effort at the handle allows you to lift a much greater load, a little bit of effort at the heel allows you to lift a much greater load. That's the mechanical situation at the ankle. And if we address that in how we do our heel raises, the calves aren't as tough to work as you might think. You may just have bad calves, but at least you won't trash your feet while you're trying to build them. Here's another myth. The soleus can only fully contract when your leg is bent at a 90-degree angle and has more sophisticated subpoint. The seated calf raise puts the gastroc into active insufficiency. Okay, one minor digression. It's not a calf raise, it's a heel raise. The calf contracts, but the heel raises. Back on track. Knee bend has no effect on whether the soleus works or not. Again, back to the anatomy chart, the soleus connects the tibia and fibula to the heel. Okay? So whenever you lift your heel or point your toe or otherwise plantar flex, the soleus is working. Now if you have a particularly deficient soleus, you might be tempted to try the seated heel raise with a barbell here, but I'm about to explain, it's really not that great of a soleus exercise. And since you can generally handle a lot of weight on it, it's going to put more stress on the foot than it might be worth. The real challenge is in how to train the gastroc. Lock your knees during calf exercises to work the gastroc, and the subpoint from earlier, the seated heel raise puts the gastroc in active insufficiency. Not that simple. Okay, first, active insufficiency is the weakness that happens when the ends of a muscle are too close together or too stretched. With a two-joint muscle like the gastroc, you want the muscle shortened over one joint and stretched over the other, and then vice versa throughout the rep, because that's where it can exert the most force, not stretched over both or shortened over both. In the seated heel raise, at the top, the gastroc is shortened over the ankle and shortened at the knee, but at the bottom, the so-called stretch position, the gastroc is short over the knee and stretched at the bottom. A strong biomechanic position. So you're really not isolating the soleus with this movement. The gastroc helps you out of the bottom, and then it pulls into active insufficiency. You have a similar situation with the straight knee heel raise, the ones that you're supposed to keep your knees locked. You have a similar situation with the straight knee heel raise, the one you're supposed to keep a locked knee on. At the bottom, the gastroc is stretched over both the knee and the ankle, so it's an active insufficiency. The soleus gets you out of the bottom, and then at the top, the gastroc is shortened at the ankle, stretched at the knee, it's back near favorable length. So either heel raise, whether it's bent knee or a locked knee, puts the gastroc in active insufficiency for at least half the movement and uses the soleus for the entire movement. Here's the way to efficiently, congruently work the calves. Use any kind of heel raise or toe press except for the seated bent knee version. Start with a slight break in your knees at the bottom position. Lean forward so that your weight is over the metatarsal break, the balls of your feet, to avoid the wheelbarrow effect. Angle your heels out, not to emphasize one head over the other, but so that the metatarsal break bends with the block, not across it. Then lift your heels, straighten your knees, don't try to go up on the toes. And then you reverse the action and repeat the action until the cows come home. See, calves, when they grow up, they turn into cows. Supposedly, Mike Mentzer said that about Roger Callard's calves in a contest back in the 70s. Or you could do this classic exercise, which also meets the requirements for congruent calf work. Here's the bottom line on training calves. If you have the capacity for muscular calves, anything you do, even the wrong stuff will bring it out. The issue is how much wear and tear you want to bring on your feet and ankles. Whatever you're going to get with that slightly bent knee and the weight on the metatarsal break. Here's another conventional tool that can really mess you up if you do it wrong, but with the proper application of moment arms and biomechanics can merely be tedious. The snow shovel. Now, careless technique has you lifting the snow with your arms and then either tossing it forward or twisting to the rear. This is risky on your back for two reasons. Okay, first, you're lifting the load not just at arm's length, but through an extended moment arm, so it feels and acts heavier than its actual weight. Now this shifts your center of gravity towards the load, which should make you fall face first into the snow, since your center of gravity is now outside of your base of support. Now usually you don't, because the small, deep muscles around the spine contract to counter the load, but the extreme torque and high repetition set you up to strain these muscles. And if you slouch as you're shoveling, that situation gets worse. And then if you twist ballistically to empty the shovel, you put your discs at risk, because while the spine allows rotation, it's not particularly strong at it. Here's how you would shovel in a biomechanically congruent fashion, taking full advantage of the moment arms while protecting your spine area. First, chop the snow into a manageable amount, and then slide the shovel underneath. Next, square your feet under your hips like you're about to squat. With the handle of the shovel resting across your thigh and your weight leaning into the grip, you're going to squat. Now here would be the load, here would be a long moment arm, here would be a fulcrum, a short moment arm, but your body weight acting through the short moment arm helps lever the shovel up. Now you use your free hand as close as you can get to the load and stand straight up. The front arm doesn't bend. Don't lift with your biceps, just hold on. So now this hand becomes the fulcrum, the snow is the load, a short moment arm, the fulcrum, a long moment arm, and this arm acts as a strut absorbing the upward motion. So your body weight resisting through this long moment arm is easily enough to counter the relatively small load of snow acting through the short moment arm. You're in balance. There's no shift in your center of gravity, no compensation by the muscles around your spine, theoretically no back strain. To finish the rep, your hand and foot on the same side move together. So if you're going to dump to the right, you step to the right. If you're going to dump to the left, step to the left. You're going to turn your body, not twist, until the very end when you do twist. So to save your energy for your workout, to protect your back, that's how you do it. Or a snowblower works too. Coming in 2010, Optimal X, the home workout, and Biomechanics for Better Workouts, a trainer's guide. Both in manuals, videos, and blogs. Thank you for your support this year.